So, Mercury, also known as quicksilver, is the only metal that is liquid at standard conditions for temperature and pressure. This heavy and silvery liquid metal mostly occurs in nature as a cinnabar or mercuric, sorry, here, yeah, mercuric sulfide, from which mercury is extracted by using different technologies which have changed over centuries. As we shall see, its peculiar mechanical features attracted the attention of ancient natural philosophers, physicians, and alchemists since at least the classical period. On the other hand, because of its toxicity, very strict rules regulate today the use of mercury. And for these reasons, important European mines have been dismantled and closed since the end of the 20th century, and the towns built around the extraction sites have been cleaned up. There is a very nice example in Italy, actually in the area of the Amiata Mount. The ancients were also aware of mercury toxicity and its dangerous effects on human health. Dioscorides, for instance, warned against the noxious properties of cinnabar, which he identified with the Spanish minium, or minium in Latin, that is the mercury sulfide, and distinguished from the kinnabari, or dragon's blood, namely the exudation or the resin from the oriental plant Dracaena. While the vegetal substance had many medical applications, cinnabar was toxic, as was evident from the suffocating smell it produces when heated in the furnaces. Pliny urged those who treated cinnabar in the workshop for the production of red pigments to protect their face with mask of bladder skin in order to avoid inhaling the dust, which is highly pernicious. In a work only extant in Syriac translation, the Greco-Egyptian alchemist Zosimus of Panopolis reports mercury has a cold nature and kill those who drink it. The philosopher is Democritus, the alchemist Democritus, said that those who have been affected by mercury are like a thirsty and drunk man. A detail, this one, that seems to hint at the dangerous effects of mercury, especially on the human nervous system. One might wonder at this point why someone should drink mercury. I will address this point later in my talk. For now, we must note that similar information is reported by ancient pharmacological texts, which often include mercury among the mineral drugs, the metallica in Greek, that they describe. Moreover, the liquid metal represents a key topic discussed in ancient alchemical literature, from the writings ascribed to Democritus and Maria de Gives to the works of Zosimus of Panoply and early Byzantine authors. In this respect, I will touch upon three main points in my talk. I will present a choice of relevant ancient sources on the extraction and properties of mercury, mainly taken from ancient alchemical and medical literature. In doing so, the replications in modern laboratories of ancient recipes will help us to better grasp ancient technologies and to anchor them to the development of specific theories on the nature of mercury. And I will conclude my talk by presenting a few late antique and Byzantine medical texts which might hint at possible influences of the alchemical literature on the later development of pharmacology. A scattered fragment of the comic poet Philippus, early 4th century BCE, represents the earliest record of quicksilver, of mercury in ancient Greek literature. The fragment is paraphrased in a passage from Aristotle's On the Soul, where Aristotle reports that the comic poet Philippus said about the movements of a curious puppet or automaton in Greek. He, so the comic poet Philippus, said that Daedalus made a wooden statue of Aphrodite move by pouring liquid silver, so basically mercury, into it. Scholars agree on identifying the substance called liquid silver with the quicksilver of mercury, and even if Aristotle never addresses this issue, a certain set of methods for extracting mercury from cinnabar was certainly known in the peripatetic school. Theophrastus, indeed, provides us with the earliest description of one of these extraction techniques. In his short treatise on stones, we read, this is chapter or paragraph 60. Liquid silver, again, actually argyros kritos in Greek, is produced when cinnabar is crushed with vinegar in a copper mortar with a copper pestle. According to this procedure, mercury was obtained simply by grinding cinnabar and vinegar in a copper pestle. Theophrastus introduces this information in a section dealing with artificial substances, namely pharmaca, that could be used either as pigments or as medicinal drugs. Interestingly, a few centuries later, the same procedure was recorded in Pliny the Elder's natural history. In a section of Book 33 on minerals, Pliny discusses the medical uses of mercury. He warns his readers against the risk of using quicksilver in medicine, since it is as toxic as all the other substances that derive from cinnabar. He reports that some physicians tend to apply it to the head or to the belly for arresting hemorrhage, provided that it did not penetrate the human body. And Pliny, on the contrary, did not recommend this practice. On the other hand, he introduces this section by describing two methods for extracting mercury, and the first method is the one that you can read in the slide. Again, is the same method described by Theophrastus. It is made in two ways, so mercury, quicksilver, is made in two ways, by grinding minium, so cinnabar, in vinegar with a copper pestle in a copper mortar, or, and the second method is a distillation technique, basically. This process described by Pliny and by Theophrastus has been identified by the chemist Laszlo Tarax with a mechanochemical reaction. The vinegar had a purely mechanical action, allowing for a closer physical contact between the solid ingredients that were expected to react. This reaction would have been very slow in the opinion of the chemist and historian of chemistry, Kenneth Claude Bailey, who wrote a very interesting chemical commentary on Pliny the Elder's chemical chapters. He called it in this way. Basically, it's a selection of chapters taken from the natural history. And this is the report on his own experience in replicating this extraction technique. The editor has repeated the experiment by grinding cinnabar with vinegar and copper turnings. In the cold, the reaction is very slow, indeed, but on heating it, it takes place readily enough, copper sulfate being formed, while the surface of the copper turnings becomes covered with a copper-mercury amalgam from which the mercury may be driven off by heating. Bailey read Pliny's account and immediately recognized that copper, that is the metal which pestle and mortars were made of, represented a key reagent in the process. Cinnabar, indeed, is reduced by copper, thus yielding mercury. With a team of chemists at the University of Bologna, we also tried to replicate the extraction technique described by Theophrastus and Pliny. First, we used a copper mortar, you can see it on the right, and rather than copper turnings, as in Bailey's experiment, and by simply grinding cinnabar in vinegar, we were not able to extract mercury. However, after washing the mortar, we did realize that a change of color took place in both the mortar and the pestle. In fact, both the head of the pestle is here and the bottom of the mortar became a kind of whitish or shining metal. It is likely that some mercury was extracted from cinnabar and reacted with the copper pestle and mortar, thus producing this silvery amalgam. That is, this is a sign that some mercury was basically produced. This impression was somehow confirmed when we used a ceramic mortar to grind cinnabar, vinegar, and copper filings. After grinding for a few minutes, we could see that the color of the copper filings, you can see it, I mark it with this little red circle, and the color of the copper filings changed by turning silvery. We then tested the reaction by manually grinding cinnabar and copper powder with some drops of vinegar, and the powder slowly turns black, and after grinding for 1 hour, drops of mercury are clearly visible. You can see it here in the bottom of the vessel of the mortar. By ball milling cinnabar and copper with some drops of glacial acetic acid, after 6 hours, it is possible to reach the completeness of the reaction. In order to better understand the described technology, we also took into account the information provided by early alchemical sources, which expanded the range of metals used to treat cinnabar and produce the liquid metal. In his work, usually referred to as the chapters to Eusebius, Zosimus of Panopolis, this Greco-Egyptian alchemist, he lived in the 3rd, 4th century CE, he includes detailed discussion on chemical ingredients and procedures. And this paragraph actually deals with mercury. I think, this is Zosimus that is talking, I think that it's better to pound or to grind cinnabar. In fact, different substances produce quicksilver. In Greek, we have nephele, actually, that is a cloud, but this is a kind of a deckname for quicksilver or for mercury in alchemical literature. So in fact, different substances produce quicksilver when they are processed with water or vinegar in the sun. And we know this from experience. And every book, and Chimes and Maria say, lead mortar and lead pestle. Pound cinnabar with vinegar in the sun until quicksilver or mercury is produced. They do the same with tin. Two elements deserve special attention in this passage. The procedure is here ascribed to two early alchemical authors, namely Maria the Jewish and Chimes, whose works probably date to the 1st, 2nd century CE. A continuous dialogue with those authors who were considered the founders of alchemy is a typical feature of the writings by Zosimus, who nevertheless also claims to have direct experience of the technique. This quotation from Maria and Chimes testifies to the circulation of the extraction technique described by Theophrastus and Pliny among the earliest authors who laid the foundation of Greco-Egyptian alchemy. On the other hand, if we have a closer look at the technique as described by Zosimus, two important differences can be detected in comparison with the description basically provided by Theophrastus and Pliny. Lead mortars are used rather than tools made of copper, thus expanding the range of metals used for the extraction procedure or process. Moreover, tin, and this is the last sentence in the passage, tin is added as a proper ingredient, and it does no longer enter the process as the metal of which the tools were made. These technical innovations are confirmed in Zosimus' alchemical treatises preserved in Syriac translation. In particular, in book 9, that is basically devoted to mercury, we find a very interesting recipe that describes again a similar extraction technique of mercury from cinnabar. And this is taken from a manuscript kept at the Cambridge University Library. It's manuscript MM629. And the recipe reads, another recipe, in Syriac is a sir, that means is like in Greek allo. Take copper powder and grind cinnabar with water. Little by little, you will collect the mercury, and again, this is the cloud, so that is the translation of nefele, that floats on the surface with a sponge until all this mercury disappears and dries up. Then put what is left in a vessel without a lid. You will cover it with another vessel and place this vessel on a fire, and you will find mercury in the upper vessel. In lines with this new information, we also replicated the extraction technique by adding both lead and tin. The replication confirmed that lead can reduce mercury. However, no drops of mercury are visible due to the formation of a powdery mercury-lead amalgam. Likewise, when the reaction takes place with tin, here, the formation of amalgam is clearly obtained, and this amalgam, this is silvery actually paste here, this amalgam is very soft, and ancient alchemists probably tended to identify this substance with a kind of mercury, since it's very similar actually to the mercury, to the real metal, that is the pure metal, I mean. This is an alloy, basically, an amalgam between tin and mercury. And indeed, according to the extractions given by the last recipe of Zosimus, the Egyptian alchemists used to heat the metallic amalgams produced by grinding cinnabar with different metals, and could thus easily recover the mercury that was mixed with lead, tin, or even copper in the amalgams. Mercury, indeed, has a very low melting point and can be easily distilled. So basically, if we heat this paste, mercury evaporates and can be recovered very, very easily. These practices might have provided ancient alchemists with an experimental proof of their theories on the nature of mercury. They believed, in fact, that mercury could be extracted from any metallic body, being a fundamental constituent of them. A passage from Zosimus' Syriac writings is quite explicit in this respect. He writes in the same book on mercury that I quote before, on the fact that mercury comes from all the metallic bodies, and this is the title, let's say, of this short passage, since he believed that mercury is the unique substance that comes from all the metallic body, all bodies, Pebicius, and this is an Egyptian alchemist that lived in the 1st century CE, stopped at the market, probably the market of Alexandria, and shouted, all the metallic bodies are mercury. This idea was further confirmed by other techniques that the ancient alchemists developed to process and transform mercury. Today, we won't have time to properly explore this technology, in particular the various recipes dealing with the solidification, in Greek the pexis, so the fixation basically of mercury. Similar practices are already mentioned by earlier Greek Egyptian alchemists such as Pseudo-Democritus and Zosimus of Panoply, who used to combine mercury with other minerals to fix, so to speak, its fluid and moist nature. Many recipes included in Byzantine alchemical manuscripts prescribed to combine mercury with sulfur, thus producing an artificial cinnabar that was identified with the red mineral from which mercury was extracted. These recipes are quite detailed and often emphasize that the procedure first produces a black compound of which the alchemist does not have to be afraid. In fact, by carrying out the described technique properly, it is possible to get a substance as red as cinnabar. In order to quickly illustrate this process, I will show you some pictures of the replication we carried out in the laboratories of the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. As described in the recipes, in the Byzantine recipes, we melted sulfur in a crucible and pour some mercury over it. So this is in the center, you have the melted sulfur, and on the right, the sulfur with mercury. And we started heating the flask with a gentle fire by using a modern mantle heater. However, the heat was too weak and only a bit of sulfur, this yellow vapor, sublimed and deposited on the upper part of the vessel. Therefore, we used a charcoal fire as prescribed by ancient recipes. Once sublimated, sulfur and mercury became vapors that react with each other and produce a black compound which solidifies on the wall of the vessel. By following the instruction of Byzantine recipe, we did not lose hearts because of the black color. On the contrary, we broke the flask here and we scraped the black compound off and started grinding it. And after grinding it for a while, the color of this black compound immediately turns into a bright red compound. And this is basically the artificial cinnabar. I mean, has the same, even the same chemical composition than the natural ore, than the cinnabar. As we have seen, such a technology was developed on the basis of procedures that were already described in earlier texts, such as Theophrastus and Pliny the Elder. In the passage quoted above, Pliny also records a technique to heat the cinnabar in a closed apparatus so that mercury could sublimate and solidify in the upper vessel. The same technique is illustrated also in the entry on mercury of Dioscorides' treatise on pharmacy that we have quoted at the beginning of this paper. This treatise of Dioscorides, this De Materia Medica by Dioscorides, certainly influenced early alchemical authors, as we can clearly infer from this 3rd century papyrus, which transmit a collection of alchemical recipes. Indeed, in the last 2 leaves, this papyrus, this Leiden papyrus, is the number 10, actually, in the collection, includes various excerpts from Dioscorides' pharmacological work. The section is separated from the rest of the recipe book by the title, you can read it and mark it in red, Dioscoridou, actually, Ectu Peri Ules, so by the Dioscorides from the book on the matter, Eule, but on the medicinal matter, so basically on the materia medica. And we have a section with different, basically, entries on 9 different ingredients. And the last one, this is in the second, actually, folio of the papyrus. The last one is about Hydrargoras, so it's about mercury. And this is basically Dioscorides' section on the extraction of mercury from cinnabar. And it is interesting that Dioscorides, at the end of this section, and this part is not reported in the alchemical papyrus, but this last paragraph is only in the pharmacological treatise. Actually, Dioscorides writes, Hydrargoras, so mercury, has deadly properties when drunk, again, so there is again this emphasizing how someone can drink mercury, but has deadly properties when drunk, eating away the inner parts of the human body, we can infer, with his weight. He then recommends drinking large quantity of milk to cope with these deadly effects. Likewise, Galen devotes only a short section of his treatise on the properties of simple drugs to quicksilver, to mercury. And in this very short entry, Galen writes, quicksilver does not range among the natural drugs, but among the artificial ones, such as white lead, verdigris, and each solve and litharge. I do not have any experience in the use of this drug, neither when it is drunk, it is in fact mortal, deadly, or when it is applied externally. This statement is confirmed by a few other passages in which Galen lists mercury among the substances which, if swallowed, may ulcerate and harm the stomach. and he equates quicksilver to other poisonous ingredients that cause serious damages when ingested, even in small quantities. The same information taken from both Dioscorides and Galen is reported by early Byzantine physicians, especially in early Byzantine medical encyclopedias, such as Oribesius' medical collections and Aetius of Amida's medical books. However, some later medical sources stand out against this picture and introduce new information on the possible medical uses of mercury. A recently edited recipe book preserved in Syriac language includes mercury among the ingredients used to prepare a medical antidote against any kind of disease, basically. And this recipe book includes a recipe that is introduced by the title Preparation of Pills of Mercury. You can see the title marked in red here. And here we have just Udrurkurus, that is just the translation, the transcription in Syriac script of the Greek term Udrargoros. And in the second part of this recipe book, there is also an important reference to Hermes Trismegistos, so to basically to this author that is also very often presented as one of the earliest alchemists in Byzantine alchemical literature. And this Hermes Trismegistos is basically is labeled as magistros, as magister, in this text. And this is clearly a Latin loanword, and this can be also a hint to date this recipe book to a late period, and probably a late Alexandrian period. And because this kind of material in Syriac, this pharmacological collection are usually called kunnasha, they very often draw on basically late Alexandrian medical material. I have still 5 minutes. Is it okay, Maria? A second interesting source for this, for the possible medical applications of mercury in early Byzantine literature is the medical compendium by Paul of Aegina. And this is basically the entry on mercury that is Paul included in the last book of his collection that is devoted to drugs, to medicines. As poisonous, quicksilver does not by any means contribute to medical practice. So at the beginning, Paul is in line with what already Galen and Dioscorides said. However, there are some people who burn it to ashes, mix the ashes with other species, and give it as a drink to people suffering from colic and intestinal obstruction. After stressing the dangerous effects of quicksilver, in line with let's say the traditional medical accounts we already read, and Paul presents the intriguing case of some unspecified people who prepare specific drugs by burning quicksilver to ashes. A slight different version of Paul's entry on mercury is preserved in a rich Byzantine compendium on pharmacology transmitted by the Bologna manuscript 3632. This is a manuscript that dates to the 15th century. And again, we are in a section on the use of metals of dametallica, of mineral drugs in pharmacy. And we read this entry on Udrargoros. You can read Udrargoros here, basically, in red. Mercury, it is also mixed to drugs that are effective against wounds and itch. It is poisonous if ingested. However, there are some people who burn it to ashes, mix the ashes with other species, and give it as a drink to people suffering from colic and intestinal obstruction. Clearly, the second part is a quotation from Paul of Aegina, while the first part had some interesting details that are not found, at least I wasn't able to find the first details about this use of mercury against wounds and itch in any other Byzantine medical encyclopedia. Another interesting point in this manuscript is on the right of this manuscript, you can see basically, now there is my face in front of it, but you can see this small circle, and this is a representation of the mineral. And this is a feature that is quite unique of this Byzantine manuscript, where we have pictures. I mean, they are not very elaborated, but at least there is an attempt to draw or to represent minerals along with animals and plants that are usually actually described and also represented in pharmacological compendia, Byzantine pharmacological compendia. This is another page of this manuscript where we find different minerals. You can read here kinnabari, so cinnabar, and you have this nice red, basically, circle here that is a representation of the mineral of cinnabar. And apart from these peculiar features in terms of images, I think that this emphasis on the use of mercury and this attempt to process mercury in a way that can be used as a drug, as a medicinal drug, is a quite interesting point that basically is against the picture provided by more traditional medicine like Galen's and Dioscorides accounts. As early as the 50s, Tompkins commented on the passage by Paul of Aegina by writing, were they medical men like Dioscorides or Galen, or were they alchemists or possibly alchemists practicing medicine? This is a comment on the second part of this passage, where basically Paul of Aegina and our anonymous compiler speak about people burning mercury to ashes and using it as a drink. Now, I think basically that we may now substantiate this occasional remark by Tompkins if we read our alchemical and medical passages along with the many alchemical texts that focus on the chemistry of mercury and provide, as I have tried to explore today, a variety of methods to process and transform the liquid metal. Moreover, Byzantine alchemists explicitly compared the procedures for burning metals to ashes with contemporary medical practices. For instance, the 7th century alchemist Stephanos of Alexandria writes in his second lecture, matters incinerated and reduced to ashes pertain to the men skilled in medicine. Such things also relate to the easily apprehended art, and this is alchemy, especially they who cook together the ash of common plants with the like and melt together the ashes of metallic bodies and glasses with the like, so that there is no need to be afraid of burning and reducing to ashes all these bodies. We cannot exclude at this point that physicians looked at contemporary alchemical tradition from which they may have taken method and technologies that they try to integrate in their medical practice. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Matteo. That was wonderful. David.
Yes, thank you. Great. So, well, thank you very much indeed for this extremely interesting and richly documented paper. So you can all hear me okay? This is all, yeah, we're all good, yeah. Yeah, so as Maria mentioned, my own research interests are focused especially on Greco-Roman medicine in particular, and there's a great deal of food for thought here from that perspective. But of course, the wider alchemical tradition you outlined here, and especially its apparent continuities over very long periods of time, is of great interest. And the experimental approach you're taking with this material is also extremely illuminating and offers not just clarification on the technical aspects of the recipes recorded, and in particular what they don't describe, what they leave up to the reader. But this can also enrich the way we read these texts in a much more profound way as well. And it's also especially welcome to see the key significance of the Syriac material that you're making available here too. So overall, I mean, I find your discussion and argument here absolutely persuasive and very enlightening, and I don't really have any sort of general comments to make on the overall content of the paper. So instead, I thought I might just draw attention to some of the main areas that were of interest to me and to ask some questions, mostly quite general, about those. So I've got sort of 4 main questions here. The first is about sort of the earlier stages of the alchemical tradition that might underlie this kind of later material that you focus on in particular here, especially going back to the early Roman period and perhaps back into the Hellenistic period as well. And then I also wanted to sort of ask it a little bit more generally about the experimental approach you're taking and on what that, what sorts of results or how that sort of alters your approach to the material. And thirdly, I just wanted to ask, especially reflecting my own interests, about the influence of alchemy on medicine, and again, how far back that might actually go. And then finally, about the possible significance of the Hermetic tradition, about these references to Hermes, Trismegistos, and how far that might be kind of in the background here and how significant that might be. So just to sort of elaborate a little bit more on those 4 main questions. So the first one, as I say, is quite general and really stems from my own ignorance about ancient alchemy and its associated forms of technical knowledge. So I was struck, especially by the apparent continuity throughout antiquity of the methods and techniques that you've described so clearly here. So I was wondering in general about what evidence we have for alchemical, or perhaps we might talk of proto-alchemical practices or traditions, which is especially derived from earlier periods. And for example, I mean, to draw attention to the Dioscorides and Pliny material, so there seems to be clear evidence that that Dioscorides and Pliny were both drawing on some well-established mineralogical knowledge. And in general, coincidences found between Dioscorides and Pliny are often thought to represent their use of a common source, of an individual source. And the pharmacologist Sextius Niger, who was working in the earlier 1st century AD, has been suggested by Max Wellman in particular as a likely suspect. But of course, our earliest source, Theophrastus, is very much earlier than these authorities. But as you've shown here, he seems to be using or describing basically similar processes. So I was just wondering generally how much evidence there is for activity in this area in the classical and Hellenistic periods. So is there much sign of a lot of work going on which is now mostly invisible to us, especially in places like Ptolemaic Egypt? And if so, is it right to think of this as associated with alchemy in particular, or is it really kind of too early to talk about alchemy rather than connected with broader sort of toxicological interest in poisons or mineralogy more generally? So that was kind of my first sort of area of interest. And then secondly, concerning your methodological approach, another striking and innovative aspect of your research is the testing and replication of the procedures described in these texts. So as you've shown, this is a methodology with enormous potential and scope. And I know that there are several recent projects on ancient pharmacology and cosmetics and so on, which are also placing more emphasis on this kind of hands-on experimental approach. So I noted that one of the repeated directions in Zosimus's versions of the recipes for reducing cinnabar is that it should be carried out in direct sunlight. There's this repeated mention of being in helio. And I also noted that your own experiments found that heat was often necessary for achieving the desired results as described. So I mean, I'm sure there are difficulties in actually performing these experiments in the sunshine, but I was wondering how that presumably you weren't able to replicate that and you had to find other ways to sort of simulate it, but that's sort of an interesting. I was wondering how that how that sort of heat element actually plays into it. But I was also interested just generally to know how, I mean, just thinking about how much replicating these techniques yourself, how much that's kind of changed the way that you conceptualize these texts, and the sort of more sort of deep-seated ways that it sort of changes your perspective, I suppose. And then on the medical side of things, I mean, given my own interests, I was particularly struck and extremely interested by your general argument concerning the influence of alchemical writers on contemporary medicine. And as you discuss, Dioscorides' analysis of mineral substances in Book 5 of the De Materia Medica certainly had an impact on the later alchemical tradition. And as you note, exemplified especially by that Leiden papyrus from Thebes that you draw attention to. But you've obviously isolated here some very clear evidence that the line of inference was also going in the other direction, and not just in connection with poisons and toxicology, but also in a more sort of narrowly therapeutic, beneficial context. So I was interested in your note that Pliny was already aware of various medical uses for these derivatives of minium, as of the cinnabar that he used the word minium. But he was very wary of them because of their toxicity and was only prepared to allow the possibility of external applications. So there was clearly an established medical tradition of using these substances based on these techniques to treat various conditions, as he discussed by the 1st century AD. And I was just looking at the Dioscorides passage as well, in connection with this, and I noted that the chapter before he discussed the hydrar gyros, the mercury proper, he has a chapter on kinnabari, which he introduces with the comment that some people confuse kinnabari with the substance called minion, from which mercury is derived. And then he records some of the medical applications of what's properly called kinnabari, according to him, which is the plant-based product, which includes its use in eyesals. But he also then mentions the same application that Pliny records for minium, which is its use in staunching blood flow or stopping hemorrhage. So yeah, and in Lily Beck's translation, he says, the kinnabari is a great deal more suitable for eye medications, for it is more astringent, wherefore it also staunches blood, and it treats burns and pustules when compounded with cerat. So I was just wondering whether Dioscorides and Pliny, in this case too, may have been drawing on the same pharmacological source, which noted medicinal uses for the derivatives of minion. But in this case, Dioscorides, with his sort of more up-to-date technical knowledge, observed that the source was mistaken in its confusion of minion and kinnabari, whereas Pliny seems unaware of that confusion, and he even says that the Greeks call minium kinnabari a few chapters earlier. So yeah, I mean, that was just one point, but I mean, in any case, I think your investigations have certainly revealed clear evidence for the influence of alchemy on medicine here, and that this opens up some very interesting lines of inquiry. But perhaps there are ways to think about that kind of process happening a little bit earlier as well. And then just finally on the question of Hermes and the Hermetic tradition in the background. So, I mean, perhaps, in thinking about this relationship between alchemy and medicine, I mean, I think, as you've suggested here, that, perhaps we shouldn't distinguish too sharply between sort of alchemical and medical traditions, but rather sort of think of grayer areas of overlap. And in particular, this, Hermes Trismegistus, I think, is perhaps an interesting kind of background to this. So I was wondering how important you think this Hermetic tradition actually might be to these forms of knowledge, and especially to the contexts in which the alchemical and medical traditions might have been interacting. And I mean, this is certainly not my own area of expertise, but I do remember some years ago looking at some of these so-called iatromathematical papyri, which combine medical and astrological knowledge, but especially in connection with pharmacological substances, mineral and plant-based, in a way which seems to be connected very strongly to Hermetic traditions. And I'd think too of the surviving treatise on the powers of drugs, or the De Virtutibus Herbarum, which is attributed to an individual called Thessalus, which of course also has specifically medical therapeutic focus, but draws heavily on astrological knowledge, and in some of its recensions, it again explicitly describes the source of this knowledge as a revelation from Hermes Trismegistus. And it's interesting too that a lot of this material hasn't survived in the mainstream Greek medieval manuscript tradition. Much of our Greek evidence comes from the Egyptian papyrological record. And so it seems all the more important, therefore, to make full use of the hitherto neglected Syriac material that you've obviously been working on as well. So yeah, but I mean, I just wondered how significant you think that Hermetic background might be in this particular alchemical context. So yeah, so those are just some sort of more general. Hope I haven't sort of overloaded you with too many questions there, but that's just some of the things that I wanted to follow up on. But thank you very much again for your paper.
Thank you very much, David, for your comment and your questions. Should I reply now, Maria? Yeah, okay, because these are very important and difficult questions. I can actually just hint at some elements in the different direction that you suggested, because and some of the questions I think are related with others. So because the main problem when we look at let's say what is alchemy before the 1st century AD, so in the Hellenistic Egypt, for instance, or even in the classical period. So the question is that we don't have basically an identity for an alchemist at that period. I mean, the earliest alchemical work that at least the later tradition recognizes such is this recipe book by Pseudo-Democritus that was produced in the 1st century in Egypt, for sure, more or less in the 1st century AD. So before that period, and what is very peculiar, I think, in that treatise is that we have a combination of different expertise, kinds of expertise that before that period maybe belonged to different experts. So at some point there was someone who combined these different kinds of expertise that all of them had to do with dyeing techniques. So I think for a lot of specific techniques, we can trace back then to classical sources. So we can, for sure, talking about chemical arts in the classical Greece, and basically one of the aim of the project in Bologna is to look back to the Babylonian tradition, where we find many techniques that are similar to what is described in this earlier chemical literature. But what is more difficult is to find a label, you know, to put under this all these wide set of technologies, of procedures, of kind of craftsmanship that can be reconstructed from earlier sources than the alchemical one. But we don't have a box, say, where to put all these material. So this is one of the questions that I have, and a possible line of investigation, and this also relates to your second question on the relationship between medicine and alchemy. I was looking at Galen, for instance, in the Metodo Medendi, so in the method of healing, in all the critique against the Tesseros, for instance, he very often referred to dyers and metal workers and all people working with pharmaca, but not medical drugs, but other kind of pharmaca, that at some point want to learn medicine, you know, because they wanted to follow Tesseros' teaching that medicine was easy to be learned in a few months, okay? And of course, Galen is very critical against this approach. But what is interesting is to see which kind of, craftsmen at some point approached medicine. And I think this might be, a kind of evidence that point to this gray area of overlapping, as you were saying, between these two expertise, basically. And because in the earlier alchemical texts, we have a lot of references to medicine. Pseudo-Democritus, for instance, when he wants to describe the method that the alchemist has to follow in inquiring the properties of matter, he basically mentioned physicians as the model, especially pharmacists. So we know that the earliest alchemists were looking at what medicines, physicians, were doing. But it's more difficult to reconstruct the other way, basically, the other direction. And this other direction is more evident in Byzantine sources, where actually I think we can find references to practices that were performed by alchemists. And this has to do with your third question about the Hermetic tradition, I think, because in this later Byzantine tradition, very often we find an interesting combination of medical sources and Hermetic, this medical tradition that you were referring to. For instance, in the section in the Bologna manuscript, in the section that precedes the part on metals, there is a very long section on stones. And this is a compilation that is composed by combining passages from the lapidaries of Diogenes, Dionysus, for instance, or the Kerygmata or Orphei, all this kind of tradition, of Hermetic tradition of lapidaries, and Aetius of Amida, that somehow is summarizing Galen. So you have Galen summarized by the Byzantine encyclopedias and this Hermetic tradition together. And since, especially in the Byzantine, the early Byzantine period, Hermes was also believed to be the founder of alchemy, this is something that became quite clear only from the 4th, 5th century AD in alchemical literature. I think we have a nice combination where on the one hand you have Hermes that start to become one of the father of alchemy. On the other, you have Hermetic medical material that is circulating among physicians. So this might be, one of the reasons why alchemical procedures start being somehow known and investigated by physicians. Maybe because of this, Hermes in this sense could be a kind of link between these two traditions. And the last point that is about replications, and I think there are different points that I would like to emphasize, but let's stick on two main, let's say, remarks. The first one, I think that what was very important for me was reading this text with chemists. Because when an expert in chemistry, in this case, look at ancient recipes, his approach is completely different. Actually, he looks for details that are different from what we usually attract our attention. So very often the dialogue with a scientist can help even before putting a practice into laboratory, so trying to replicate. Because what is very, at least for me, was very important was to listen to all the different hypotheses that the chemists do before starting an experiment. And in proposing and discussing all these hypotheses, very often we see details that are that turn to be very important in the replication, but otherwise we wouldn't actually given the same emphasis in the text without this dialogue. And the second point, I think, is the fact that we can see, experience somehow what the ancients were seeing in their workshop. In the sense that very often some features of the products, like for instance, this silvery paste that was produced, by grinding cinnabar with tin. If you don't see how this look like, you cannot understand why the alchemist was writing, okay, this is a kind of mercury. So very often, a lot of, I think at least, some theoretical statements or some description of the substances that you can find in chemical literature is not very clear unless you can see the same stuff, the same elements or substances or products that they were seeing and they were describing. So very often is not the results that is important. Then the main question is not does this recipe work, or is not the only question that we have in mind. The question is also, even if it doesn't work, in that case we have an amalgam, so it's not mercury, of course. But if we look at what actually they achieved, what they produced, what this product can tell us about the way in which they conceptualize these elements, these realia, let's say. And I think this is a second important methodological, let's say, point in these replications that I didn't expect that was so important, but actually for the moment, this particular element, let's say, point provides me with a lot of new matter for thought, let's say, and new ways to look at the attention text. I don't know, David, if it's enough, or I can cover
No, that's fantastic. That's great. No, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, no, absolutely. That's extremely helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have some questions, Petros?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Matteo, for this very interesting and thought-provoking talk and your very detailed answer to David's questions. You have covered a lot of stuff. I'm quite interested, I mean, in the intersection between medicine and alchemy. I mean, was alchemy informed by medicine, or medicine was informed by alchemy? And I mean, can we see any starting point for this kind of interrelation, I mean, between alchemical and medical procedures? And in terms of the actual, I mean, alchemical ingredients, if I can call them, that used in medicine, I mean, were these available widely? I mean, or I mean, were physicians able themselves to prepare, or they had to go to a specific, I mean, workshop to buy this stuff? I mean, I was just wondering whether you can elaborate a little bit and provide us with some points about this, the interaction between alchemy and medicine, and I mean, whether we can say starting point at some point in antiquity, and then the development in late antiquity. And I have a brief remark, but later on.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, Petrus. Thank you very much. This is one of the key questions of my research, actually, to understand this kind of relationship. So I don't have a clear answer to this question. My feeling, basically, for the moment, is that at the beginning, the author of alchemical treatises were looking at medicine, especially from a methodological point. So medicine provided them with the method that they had to follow in order to maybe to do things right, in the sense that if you want to understand the basic theories and rules that you have to follow in manipulating and treating, natural matters and natural ingredients, you have to follow what physicians do. This is something that you very often find in the earliest alchemical treatises. So my question now is to understand whether physicians at some point were looking at what an alchemist was doing. And among the sources that I found, I think especially the source, the Syriac recipe book, where actually you have a recipe on the preparation of pills of mercury. It's quite impressive, because a pill of mercury, on the one hand, seems to be a specific medicinal product, because a pill is something that you use in medicine. On the other hand, I mean, the main ingredients seems to be a metal that is not very often used in medicine, or for sure is not ingested. This is something that all the medical authors have recommended. This, do not ingest, mercury. So this was something that was quite striking for me. Unfortunately, the recipe book is very fragmentary, so even the recipe is difficult to reconstruct, because you have different various words that cannot be read. So I hope to find further evidence for this kind of practices. And the next question is what you basically asked: to what extent physicians were preparing, drugs and medicines in their own workshop or in their own house. I don't know to what extent, because we know that from alchemical literature there is quite a strong experimental aspect, side, let's say, of alchemy in Byzantine literature. So this is easier maybe to detect, but for the physician and then to see if the practices were similar. So, but for all this kind of question, I don't have a clear answer yet.
Okay, thank you. Just a brief remark. You refer to some examples, some recipes in Byzantine literature, including quicksilver. I think there is an interesting recipe in Hippiatrika. You know, this is a very rich source of information for pharmacology. It's a text which has been neglected very much by historians of medicine. And there is a recipe, I think, which includes mercury, again with vinegar and fat, for seriasmos, which I think it's a sort of a disease that is caused by overexposure to sun heat or something like this, which might be of your interest in the Cambridge manuscript. I think it's quite late, this manuscript.
Is this medicine for external application, or it's like a, you know, like a cream?
It's for seriasmos.
Okay, yeah. So this is applied on the skin, let's say, of the.
I think so. Yes, I think so. You know, there are some strange names of diseases in Hippiatrika which we are not really aware of the exact nature of this disease. I mean, like Sicaminon or this kind of skin disease that's particularly relevant to horses, but we don't have any mentions in human manuals.
Thank you, Petrus. I will have a look at this.
In case it is helpful. Thank you again, and thank you, the organizers.
Yeah, thank you very much.
John, I'm sorry, John. Sorry, sorry, John.
Thank you. Super paper, Matteo.
Thank you, John.
I wanted to ask you about the guy, I think he was Egyptian, who thought that mercury was a core element in all metals. And to contrast that with what Galen says about mercury, which is very different, as you reported. And I wonder if you could put the statement about mercury being a part of all metals into some sort of ancient understanding. In other words, was this a very eccentric person who was saying something completely mental in the marketplace, or is there a theoretical case in the ancient world for mercury, perhaps because it's very soft like tin and suitable for possibly for alloys? Therefore, it means that somehow all metals are alloys and mercury belongs to it. So I wonder if you could just comment on the nature of that element as we see it and how the ancients saw it.
Thank you, John. Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is an important part of the talk, but I didn't have time to go into the details, because I quoted the passage because it's fun. Basically, okay, there is this eccentric guy shouting at the market, so it was, and also it's very early because this Pebicius is supposed to be in the 1st century AD. But this theory that mercury is a key constituent of metals and of the mineral worlds is a feature that is very peculiar of the alchemical tradition, and you can find it in different classifications of matters, and that, for instance, are provided by Zosimus itself. And the point is that mercury is soft, of course, is liquid, but also it evaporates at a very low temperature. So it is both classified among the spirits and among the bodies. The bodies are the metals and minerals, and the spirits are mercury and sulfur, basically. And for these reasons, there are a lot of different specific features of mercury that basically can explain why alchemists at some point start believing that mercury was one of the main constituents of metals. And then all this tradition was somehow inherited by the Arabic alchemical tradition, when you have a very standard theory in Arabic alchemy that all the metals are formed by sulfur and mercury, and they basically tend to identify sulfur with the dry exhalations, at the end of the 3rd book of Aristotle Meteorology, where he explains how minerals were produced in the underground, and mercury is associated with the moist exhalations. And so when you have this philosophical background, this theory became very important in all the later medieval scientific tradition. So, but the first elements that, or I think some kind of background for this theory is already in the Greek alchemical corpus, with this idea that mercury is a key constituent of metals. And maybe is much more based on practices than on theories. This association with Aristotle maybe is a bit late. But anyhow, there is this kind of prehistory, let's say, to the Arabic theory of sulfur, mercury, that is quite intriguing in Greek alchemical literature. And Bebicius is one of the first who claims that mercury is in all the metallic bodies. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
John.
Thanks, Matteo. Really cool. These replications are great. I have two questions. One is just prompted by what John said, and that is, what's the connection between cinnabar then and the positing of these two primordial elements of sulfur and mercury? It seems like more than a coincidence that you would pick these two, based on the familiarity people would have had with this, with a compound of copper sulfide. The second thing was a kind of more general question about replications. You mentioned that you use glacial acetic acid, and I saw that you're using like pretty refined mercury sulfide in your experiments. This isn't the stuff that Theophrastus says people are getting off of hills with arrows. So you're using really refined chemistry, and you're using, I guess, contemporary lab equipment, and you're using metals, and some of the metals you're using are going to reduce the mercury sulfide. And so, I mean, it's not really surprising that you end up with mercury. The question is, was this actually what they had in their workshops? Because they weren't working with things that were this refined. And so I'm playing devil's advocate, right? Because I'm in the same boat as you with these types of things, of these kinds of criticisms. But really, like, what happens if you were to actually try this with the material? You said it was hard to get any mercury, even using the materials that you had. What are the chances that somebody would get it using raw ores and the kind of contaminated metals that they had and vinegar that they had? Like how it doesn't even start clear to me that the vinegar actually really matters in this reaction. But they certainly weren't using glacial acetic acid. Like they would have been using a pretty weak vinegar. So I'm just wondering, like, what? So it's not the result's not surprising in these cases because you're already dealing with things that will lead to mercury in some form. So I just wonder about the inference then of saying that they had these materials, and how you respond to that kind of thing.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, and, maybe I can start from the second question, and actually, let's say that there are different possible approach to these problems. I think, in the sense that we are not doing historical replications. So basically, we are not using the same tools that were used by the ancients, because even in that case, you have to reconstruct them. So there is always something hypothetical behind any kind of reconstructions, even if of a tool. I think what our approach is a kind of double approach. First of all, when it's possible, in the case of cinnabar, it's possible. We try to understand which kind of reaction is at the basis of that process. And so the first replications are with actually modern, say, pure substances, in order to understand whether this reaction works, basically. And it's easier to see that when you use synthetic cinnabar, acetic, glacial acid, and rather than using the natural or vinegar. And for copper, it's difficult to know. We know that ancient had a quite pure copper, but of course it's always kind of question whether there was always a bit of like a bronze, so if it was alloyed with other metals or not. So the first question is which kind of reaction in terms of modern chemistry we can detect behind this text. And then I think because this is important to understand whether the kind of replicate, because when you replicate something, you always try an hypothesis. It's impossible to replicate a recipe without including in the process some kind of guess, because a lot of information is not there. So all this static knowledge has to be supplied by a hypothesis. And we think that the first hypothesis that is through modern chemistry can help us. But then the same replication in the picture that I show you, we tried the same replication with a natural ore of cinnabar. So we bought it in the mines of the Monte Amiata. That is, they are sometimes it's not easy to find natural cinnabar today. But we tried with it, and it worked in the same way as with artificial cinnabar. And we tried with, of course, with vinegar as well. Vinegar doesn't have any role in the reaction. That's what is important also to know from chemistry, because basically the reaction is between copper and sulfur. But apparently, when you add vinegar, you have a kind of catalytic effect. So the reaction is quicker. And this was also something interesting. And if you use glacial acid, is quicker, of course, and this can help us to test, because you don't need grinding for 3 hours, you know, to see some drop of mercury. But after seeing the drops, then you are motivated to grind even for 5 hours, you know, to reach the same result with vinegar. And so this is this kind of continuous dialogue. This was a joke, but this is kind of continuous dialogue between what we know from modern chemistry and what we can see in ancient recipes. That I think is one of the upside, if you want, of this approach, of this experimental approach. So, but it's not an historical. The question, did they do the same and in the same way by using exactly the same ingredients? This kind of question, I think, is very difficult to answer, because we don't know, because very often also because these recipes, you know, were transmitted over time. So if Theophrastus tried this recipe, or if this recipe was tried by a Byzantine monk in the 10th century, I think the kind of cinnabar that they were using is completely different. Maybe it was coming from different geographical areas, the concentration of mercury in it was different, and even the kind of vinegar was different, because we know that vinegar in antiquity was very strong, and it was quite different from our vinegar, and that all the distillation technique changed over time from the classical era up to the Middle Ages. So when we replicate this recipe, in which period we do locate our replication? Okay, that's also another question. When texts like these are copied 100 times in different periods and are quoted by many authors living in different historical and geographical areas. So I think that your question is the key question, actually, but I think a methodology that can cover, that can avoid all this risk is, to my eyes, has not yet been discovered, let's say. Okay, and for the first question about, I think that in the moment in which alchemists realized that by combining mercury and sulfur, it was possible to produce cinnabar, this was a very important step in theorizing that mercury was one of the components of minerals, because they were able to fix mercury. And if you, in Aristotle, in the fourth book of Meteorology, there is this big claim. Aristotle claims mercury cannot be frozen, cannot be fixed, because there are too much air in it. So even if a very low temperature, mercury is always liquid. And when alchemists started, you know, seeing that by combining mercury with other substances, they could basically freeze it, or they could make it solid. I think this was, from an experimental point of view, an important step forward in conceptualizing the idea of mercury as a constituent of minerals, so of something dry. I try, I mean, in Theophrastus, there is no way, I couldn't, I mean, this was my question. There is no way to understand whether, when he described this technique, he believed that mercury was in the cinnabar, So this technique was meant to extract mercury, or whether mercury was a product of cinnabar. So cinnabar was transformed in something different that was mercury. So I wasn't able to find the kind of theoretical background behind this technique. But maybe there are other texts that should be taken into account. But this question, I had this question in mind. Okay, did Theophrastus think that cinnabar is a kind of a box in which mercury, is inside, so you extract something, or is a quicksilver something that is produced by transforming cinnabar? And it's not very clear, I think, from the text, because the text is very short and is in this section on artificial substances. So apparently it's something that is not natural. And the same claim is also in Gehlen. But in which sense is not natural? This was something that I couldn't grasp very well.
Those are fantastic answers. Thank you.
Yes.
We've got a question by Christine. She raised her hand sometime now. Christine, please.
I'm trying to uncloak my mouth here. Okay. Thanks very much, Matteo, for a great paper. I'm always envious of people who can actually try things out. I've got two questions. One is about the actual practical use of mercury, because it's toxic, it's unstable. As you've shown us, it's an awful lot of work to actually produce it. And so why would you want to have it in the first place? And is it the challenge of trying to fix it and turn it into something different? And the other question, or not so much question as a comment actually, is on the passage from Paul that is repeated in a later text about how some people ingest burnt mercury, sort of carbonized mercury. I was wondering whether this could perhaps be a confusion at some point before that, was before Paul, with lead, between mercury and lead, because in some texts, I think it is actually Paul, but somebody else might remember, on Eleos, one thing people do supposedly do is swallow lead pellets. So I wonder if something, the similarity in color maybe caused the confusion, because that would make more sense than ingesting something clearly toxic and dangerous. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the second suggestion. I didn't think about this possibility, and it's something that I think is worth having a closer look at, because I think there is some confusion in antiquity between lead and mercury. So for maybe it's just a textual problem, or maybe at some point there was some kind of mistake between lead and mercury, and so that's something that I should look at actually. And from a, let's say, philological point of view, in terms of how the two words are written, I think it's difficult to exchange with Udragoros with Molybdos. But actually, if we think that this is a question of identifying the right ingredients, that would make sense, and maybe it would be worth to having a look at how lead was processed. If you have a similar use of lead, that might be something to be compared with the passage of Paul of Aegina. So thank you. And for mercury, from the other uses of mercury, I think a very important use was also for gilding metals. So because gold and mercury can produce very easily an alloy, an amalgam. So this amalgam is soft. Basically, you can cover, for instance, a statue, a metallic statue with this amalgam, and then if you heat, mercury evaporates and just gold is left on the surface. So this was a technique that was very often used by ancient metal workers, goldsmiths, and this is for sure one of the important uses of mercury in antiquity, and was also used to recover gold for instance, in the mines, because of this property of mercury to alloy with gold very, very easily. And then it was also very easy to separate the two ingredients. So I think especially in this kind of metalworking and goldsmithery, mercury was used by the ancient. And I don't know why someone should drink mercury. At the beginning, when I read that passage, I thought maybe just by mistake, you know, they were working with mercury, for instance, in a workshop of a metal worker, and they were but it's difficult to drink something by mistake, unless, you know, it's not easy to understand the passage. And many physicians say the same. If you drink mercury, that's very dangerous. If you drink, this was something that I couldn't completely justify, if you want.
Matteo, can I just say something on your last point?
Yeah.
I think the question of why drink mercury, I mean, it could be located within a wider question, which has to do with the fact that people at that time, let's say that they're more willing to ingest things and materials that today they look, you know, repulsive, dangerous. So I guess it has to do with the fact that, you know, how far they're willing to go in order to experiment, to verify, etc., etc. I mean, one could just cite, you know, pharmacological ingredients from the Hippocratic corpus and see that many of these stuff, you know, they make us wonder, you know, why on earth they kept, you know, ingesting this kind of urine or this kind of excrement, when obviously this wouldn't have worked on a patient. So I guess this, you know, this doesn't concern only mercury, but it concerns also, you know, other sorts of, let's say that people are more experimental and in a way, or and since I mentioned the idea of experimentation, correct me if I'm wrong, but we do not have a Greek word for alchemy, do we?
It's a late word. It's chemeia, but it's used very. We have a very few occurrences of chemeia, even in the alchemical literature.
Yeah, and I mean, I know very, very few things about alchemy. I know a bit more about paradoxography, but it seems to me that one of the things that connects these two strands of knowledge is the fact that you know, their beginnings, they're both placed at some point in the experimental environment of Ptolemaic Alexandria. We do not have a Greek word for paradoxography, so it's you know, largely a construction, our own tool of understanding these people. So my question, and we tend to think of paradoxography, and I guess of alchemy too, as a kind of not second rate, but not that seriously scientific kind of knowledge. So what I'm asking is, you know, these ways of the kind of questions that these new fields are asking, because someone, I don't remember, I think it was Petros, he asked before, you know, what are the beginnings of this process, and David as well. And my question is, can we trace the beginnings at a time when these kind of distinctions were not operative? I mean, if you look at an alchemist and you try to find out what is the connection of an early alchemist and how an early alchemist sees himself in relation to a physician, I guess we need to agree before what makes a physician a physician, whether in the, you know, in the polemical school of in the polemical environment of Alexandria, physicians who tend to slander and downgrade other physicians, they do not consider them serious scientists, etc., etc. So I guess my feeling is, although I have to say it again, I don't know a lot about alchemy. I guess that with this kind of not pseudosciences, let's call them sciences, I have no problem about that. I guess to some extent, their beginnings can be traced in what is considered at a certain historical time solid scientific thought, and at some point this takes its own way and solidifies into something. What I'm saying is that it looks like a very, very hard process to pinpoint a beginning, precisely because we do not have an etiquette or a label attached to these people from the very beginning. And it also has to do with the fact that they're not willing very much to introduce themselves as something inferior to. So yeah, I mean that's the comments, yeah, I wanted to make.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. That's one of the question, but maybe we should adapt our approach accordingly, in the sense that this is a very fluid situation what we have, I think, in Alexandria, especially in the Hellenistic period. And I think another important aspect of this picture that you provided is that, I mean, all these techni, all these arts, we know that even medicine, that is the art, if you want, par excellence, had to fight against
exactly.
other experts in order to be recognized as an important discipline. So, and of course, medicine has its role in the society is very clear. You heal, the people that have diseases. So it's an important role for alchemy, or for all these, of what I would call these chemical arts. That's very difficult to understand which kind of stature, or which kind of how they were perceived by people, by the intellectuals, if you want, of that time. So I think this is another question. This is maybe why, I mean, it's peculiar that in the earlier alchemical text, when the alchemists they call themselves the philosophers or a philosopher. So that's quite a sign of an attempt to put themselves within a specific tradition, maybe the tradition of the natural philosophy. And for drinking mercury, I think you are absolutely right. I mean, we don't have to use our own category, and all the question of the Drecapotheke is, for us, is something that completely not understandable unless we try to see things with their eyes. But if we think that there was someone drinking mercury, that means that we have to infer that someone was drinking mercury for medicinal uses. That would be a very interesting point, because that would suggest that mercury, that we do have medicinal uses of mercury already in the first centuries, let's say before or straight after Christ, but that the traditional medicine, or this kind of medical text that came down to us, just didn't recognize it as a useful or helpful medical practice. But that would be, I think you're right. I mean, we cannot say why should I drink mercury, because we know that mercury it would be a very weird practice, but we don't know how they believed, what they believed, which was their attitude, towards this metal. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matteo. I just wanted a small comment. I know that you are tired, and I will be very brief. About artificial, it's very interesting that that the earlier alchemists, they were identified themselves as natural philosophers, and I mean, we see in Theophrastus, when he talks about stones, even when he says that when he talks about technique, when he talks about art and production of stones, he says art imitates nature, but only for creating its own idea. And then in this context, he talks about transformation of stones. And you also have shown us this quotation coming from Galin talking about skevastos. I guess the context and the concept and the space of artificiality is is connected how earlier alchemists understood artificiality and the notion of skvastos played a major role, I guess, in earlier alchemy, and later on, because later on we have, I mean, it's expanded, this space expands through technological advancements and and so on. I guess this influence, again, alchemy and the way alchemists see the notion of artificiality and how, let's say, play with it, experiment with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Maria. I think this is a very important point that I mean, that we have to keep in mind, and also this distinction between what is natural and what is artificial. This, even the you know, what these two categories meant in antiquity. This is a very important question that can be approached by using alchemical literature, but I think by using any kind of technical text or technical literature from antiquity, because this distinction is a distinction that implies the concept of nature, is something quite complex, but also the concept of something that is not natural. In which sense is artificial. So that's and the idea of imitating nature, of course, is one of the ways in which ancient try to, you know, to put all these practices in a kind of link with nature. So I think these two categories are two extremely interesting and important, even tools, you know, that we can use to study and understand ancient technology. And so thank you.
I think Son had another question, and Son, you want to? Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, then thank you very much. Thank you, Matteo. Thank you, David, for a wonderful talk. Matteo, on your response. David, thank you very much. That was absolutely great.
Thank you all for
joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye. Have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Good to see you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Cheers. Yeah. Thanks, Matteo.
Thank you, David. Bye.
Μαρία, δεν μπορώ να σταματήσω το recording.